Now, some people might say, well, why can't it be part of the universe? Well, it depends upon how you define the word universe. See, sometimes people don't qualify what they mean. If we mean by universe everything that exists, then I would say, okay, that's a perfectly appropriate question. There does have to be some part of reality that is self-existent. But if by universe we mean everything that's material, everything material, energy, motion, time, all of these kinds of things, then that's a different definition than everything. I would agree that there's some part of reality that has to be self-existent, but not necessarily part of the universe because the universe is not defined as everything. So we ask, could that self-existent portion be part of the universe? Not if we define universe properly. Okay, and of course, you know what we're getting to. We're going to call that self-existent part of reality God. Now, just to get into a little bit of science, I'm not a scientist. My degrees are in the music and the fine arts and things like that, so I'm not pretending to be. I am somebody who loves to study it, who loves to read about it. I kind of have this as an avocation rather than a vocation. But the best science does tell us that at some point, probably about 13.77 billion years ago, that's a long time ago, that there was a quantum fluctuation and that everything we know as the material universe, all time, matter, energy, motion, even space itself, popped into existence. All right, there was what's called the Big Bang. And if you've watched the Big Bang Theory show on CBS, I don't know if that happens to be a favorite of yours or something you've ever watched, but if you ever listen to that song at the beginning of the series, it actually tells the story of that Big Bang and then how everything develops out of that. It's kind of an interesting song. And so there's this Big Bang, and so this particle was infinitesimally small. It's hard to believe that all that exists today starts out in this tiny micro particle, but there's an infusion of energy because of this quantum fluctuation. So there's kind of an explosion, so to speak. It's not literally an explosion, but we call it the Big Bang. And all of the universe, known universe today, expands out of that. That's why we see the universe expanding today. So from this point right here, everything we see, initially kind of a dark age, first stars start to appear, and about 400 million years later, finally the development of galaxies and planets. There's this accelerated expansion that we do observe actually today. As time goes on, the universe expands faster and faster and faster and faster, and that's why we know the heat death is coming unless somebody or someone intervenes, and that's what's happening with the universe here. However, we still have to explain what caused the Big Bang. Remember the law of cause and effect. If the universe is the effect and the bang is the cause, we still have to say, well, but something caused the bang because the bang was not self-existent. It came from the quantum fluctuation. Well, the quantum fluctuation is this sea of percolating, broiling energy, all of this stuff. So we have every right to ask, well, where did that come from? We still haven't gotten back to that self-existent something because no one claims that the bang or the quantum fluctuation is the eternal, the self-existent thing. That brings us to what we call the cosmological argument. We call it an argument because not in the bad sense of the word, like your parents would tell you to stop arguing with your sister and all this. Argument just means reasons. The cosmological argument is a powerful argument for a self-existent being. And of course, we've always called that God. So here's a syllogism. You know what syllogisms are now. Here's our first premise. Whatever begins to exist has a transcendent cause. Transcendent meaning it's above or it's greater than the effect itself. In other words, if we're talking about something like the universe, it has to be something greater than the universe. The universe can't just explain itself. So whatever begins to exist has a transcendent cause. The secondary premise, the universe began to exist. So we have to ask ourselves, are both of these premises true? If they are, then the conclusion that logically flows from this has to be true. It's not relative truth. It's ultimately something that if you agree with the truth of premise one and you agree with the truth of premise two, since whatever begins to exist has a transcendent cause, and since the universe, the best science tells us, we've just seen that, the Big Bang, began to exist, then what does that tell us about the universe? Well, you probably already guessed it. Therefore, the universe has a transcendent cause. I've included a video on this in Schoology that you can watch later, so you can get more information on that. So, how do we start defining this self-existent being? What are some of the properties or qualities that this self-existent being must have? Well, this is an ontologically necessary being. In other words, we can argue that a self-existent being must exist because that's just a part of how that being must exist. It's a part of what makes it what it is, and it's necessary for it to have these qualities. Just like if we start defining a human being, okay, we've qualified it by saying it's a human. What is it that makes a human being a human being? And we could all agree on some of those properties. Well, human being has eyes. A human being has reasoning abilities. A human being has hands and feet. We could talk about physical properties. We could talk about mental properties. We could talk about properties that have to do that we see in behavior, all kinds of things. This is why we mean that the self-existent being is ontologically necessary. Think about this. If there was ever a time when absolutely nothing existed, what would exist now? Well, you guessed it, nothing. Nothing comes from nothing. Ex nihilo nihil fit. So since something has always existed, it must have the power of being within itself. It's part of the properties of that self-existent being. It cannot not exist. I know that's a double negative. That's not grammatically correct, but I want to drive the point home. In other words, this self-existent being is eternal by nature and definition. When we start talking about what that self-existent being is, it has the power of being within itself. There's no way that it could kill itself even if it wanted to. It must exist. So if we call that God, and that's what we've always called, most of us, the self-existent being, you don't have to call it God, but that's what we have in our culture. God is simply that one part of reality that is self-existent, has the power of being within itself, and can generate lesser levels of existent or contingent reality. Now, we had a slide on this earlier in the semester in this series, but I wanted to bring it back here because now I think you begin to understand exactly what we're talking about. This helps us see the characteristics or properties of whatever the self-existent being is. And by the way, do you notice down here, generate? Is there a book in the Bible that seems similar to this word? Exactly right. The very first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis. So just like the book of Genesis is the account of how God creates, or another word we could use, generates all of physical reality, the universe, our planet, animals, plants, energy, people, whatever exists in the physical universe, that this being would logically have the power to do this. Because any being that has the power of being within itself could create other beings that would also have life, and that power would be invested solely in the self-existent being. So, this is not just opinion I would submit to you here. Feel free to disagree if you want to, but I'm making the argument that reason and science demands that if something exists, then a self-existent being must exist. Now, I don't know of anybody who would disagree with this. Does something exist? Well, you could argue that maybe there's a lot of things that don't exist. Maybe they're a part of the Matrix. But remember back in the Matrix, just because Keanu Reeves was misunderstanding what reality was, did that mean Keanu Reeves didn't exist? No, Keanu Reeves knew at least one thing, that he existed. Because as the great philosopher Descartes once said, I think, therefore I am. If we're able to think, we know that at least logic and reason demand that, well, I at least know that I exist. So we know at least we exist. And since we're not eternal, we're not self existent, we came from somewhere, then a self existent being must exist. So this is absolute rational proof that God exists. Again, we're just calling the self existent being God. It doesn't depend on the senses. So people that say, well, I would believe in God if I could see him, her, it, you don't need to be able to see God to believe that God exists because reason and even science demands that this is absolute rational proof of the existence of a self existent being. Now, again, we talk to people about this sometime, but remember, proof and persuasion are two different things. Proof is objective. Persuasion, however, is subjective. Somebody can provide you with all the proof that you would think is possible. That's still not going to necessarily persuade them. This is hard for all of us human beings to admit, but we can all choose to be irrational if we want to. Now, you might think, well, why would anybody choose to be irrational? Well, the truth of the matter is, we've all been irrational at times. I mean, you think back on your life. I think back on my life. There are times when I've thought and acted irrationally. We can talk about all the reasons as to why we might have done it, but we all go back later and we think about it, we reflect on it, we think, oh, that was really stupid. Why did I do this? Why did I say that? Why did I believe in that, sir? Why did I believe there was a monster under my bed when I was a child? That was dumb. There really wasn't a monster down there, but we really believed it when we were kids. Even as adults, we're capable of believing irrational things. Our emotions can get in the way, right? We may just desperately want to believe that this other person likes us or even loves us because we think we like or love them. And we just really want to believe it because, oh, it'd be so cool if that person loved me or liked me. And so we may believe it even though all the evidence there states that they really don't love us. They really don't like us that much. There can be biases. Think about how irrational prejudice is. For years and years, there was a whole segment of and there still is some segment of, let's say, the Caucasian population that believes, well, I'm superior because I'm white. I'm superior to other people because of my ethnic background. Well, you think about it for a second, that's really irrational. Why should my skin pigmentation have anything to do with me being superior to somebody else? That's a stupid, irrational belief, but think about the number of people over the course of history who have believed that, but yet it's irrational. Notice this quote from, and you're going to be surprised who said this. I'm not going to show you it until we finish with the quote here. But then with me, the horrid doubt always arises whenever the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind? So here's a person who's having some doubt about the evolution, the theory of evolution, obviously. You know, if we're just evolved from monkeys, so to speak, then why should we trust any conclusion or any idea of truth that our minds have come to because we're basically just an evolved monkey? We're basically just trousered apes. Now you might say, well, this is obviously somebody who's having some doubts about the theory of evolution. Look who this is. This was a letter written to William Graham back July 3rd, 1881. By the way, I don't know that this is a relative of mine, but it may or may not be, but that doesn't matter. But look who it's from. Charles Darwin. Yes, the very same Charles Darwin who first proposed the theory of evolution in his groundbreaking book on the origin of species. Pretty remarkable, huh?